Hello and welcome to In-Depth Express Analysis for the day 20th of May 2025. Core inflation and RBI's rate cuts appears on explained page in Indian Express today. An article written by Harish Damodaran, where the author talks about the recent monetary policy decision of RBI to cut down or ease the monetary policy by 25 basis point. But remember that RBI had maintained quite a strict stance from 2023 until 2025. And that was mainly driven by high inflation. Now, on one hand, the RBI was urged to focus on core inflation, but RBI continued to focus on headline inflation. Now, when you look at the decision of the RBI to keep the monetary policy stance static for last 2 years, you fail to understand what Indian economy has gone through. Indian economy has gone through the turbulent period because of geopolitics, especially Russia-Ukraine war, climatic shocks such as El Nino and La Nina, a volatile external sector as well. And recently, in last 6 months, we have seen trade wars or trade realignments. So when you look at a newspaper article that connects monetary policy directly with inflation, you fail to understand the underlying issues guiding a decision maker such as RBI. Because RBI, while looking into monetary policy, focuses on so many dimensions which are important to be appreciated, especially as a serious UPSC aspirant. That is what we are going to do in this discussion. We are going to understand all the dimensions that impact the monetary policy decisions along with hard facts and data. It is important to do so because while doing so, you will be able to cover 3 specific lines of our syllabus: Indian economy and issues relating to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment, inclusive growth and issues arising from it, effects of liberalization on Indian economy, because all of them have interconnections with each other. Also, after having gone through this discussion, you will be able to easily answer these 2 questions, which we appreciate you put on our Telegram channel. The divergence between core and headline inflation during 2023 and 25 posed a dilemma for monetary policy in India. Comment. Supply side shocks are beyond the control of central banks, yet they shape inflation and policy choices. Discuss. Let's now begin the discussion. So let's start by first understanding RBI's monetary policy stance, its prolonged pause and gradual easing. Now you can see that between February 2023 and January 2025, RBI kept the policy repo rate unchanged to the level of 6.5%. Maintaining this level for roughly 2 years is a big deal. Because if you remember, RBI had rapidly raised the repo rate from mid of 2022 to early 2023 in its response to post-pandemic inflation pressures, and thereafter adopted a wait and watch policy. In early 2025, RBI finally pivoted to monetary easing, which means reduction in the repo rate. It delivered its 2 first rate cuts of 25 basis points each in February 2025, which was the first cut since initial pandemic lockdowns, quickly followed by another 25 basis point cut in April 2025, bringing the repo down to the level of 6%. Alongside the April cut, RBI changed its policy stance from neutral to accommodative, signaling that further easing was on the table amid improving inflation metrics. So basically, you can predict if the RBI says that it is accommodative, which means that future decisions are also likely to be in the same direction. By this time, headline inflation had fallen close to 4%. Now, by this time, headline inflation had fallen close to 4% target and growth concerns were mounting. Indeed, RBI lowered its GDP growth forecast for 2025-2026 to 6.5% from earlier prediction of 6.7%, while projecting inflation at just 4%. The reason behind this the rationale for the delayed rate cuts lies in core versus headline inflation debate. So with the basics of economy, you understand that headline CPI inflation is the overall inflation in the consumer price index. It includes all categories like food, fuel, housing, and it is the measure of the RBI target. So when RBI has been tasked with the responsibility to maintain inflation 4% plus minus 2%, these digits indicate CPI headline inflation. Now, core inflation, on the other hand, refers to CPI inflation excluding food, fuel components. Now, core inflation is considered as a real measure of underlying demand-driven price trends, since food and fuel are volatile and largely affected by supply shocks. And that is why Consumer Food Price Index (CFPI) is sub-index tracking inflation in food items only. By definition, headline inflation is equal to core plus volatile items like food and fuel, roughly speaking. Now, during February 2023 to January 2025 period, which was the period of unchanged repo rate, India's inflation saw a striking divergence between headline as well as core inflation. They were not aligned together. Headline CPI averaged around 5.2%, whereas core averaged around 4.1%, and CFPI averaged around 7.6%, indicating clearly that consumers were facing steep price rises in food items on an average. In other words, once the erratic food and fuel prices were taken out, the stable core inflation was near the RBI's comfort zone. This fueled arguments from many economists and even government officials that RBI should shift focus to core inflation. Their reasoning was that supply-driven spikes in food fuel inflation caused by, you can say, war or weather conditions cannot be tamed and cannot be controlled by interest rate hikes. So monetary policy should not overreact to them. Instead, with core inflation relatively low and demand subdued, some felt that rate cut should be done. In fact, the economic survey of 2023 and 24 questioned the RBI's delay in cutting rates, noting that an anticipated easing of monetary policy had been delayed even though core inflation had fallen to just 3.1% by June 2024. So you can see even from the government quarters, the demands were and the pressures were being made on RBI to cut rates. However, RBI was extremely cautious to headline inflation still being at an elevated level of 5%. In fact, RBI Governor Shaktikant Das often emphasized that the mandate is headline CPI and persistent food inflation can lead to second round effects, higher wages, higher input costs that eventually push core inflation up if left unchecked. Now let's look at the two major supply shocks between 2022 and 2024 that drove up inflation, especially food prices in India. The first was the Russia-Ukraine war that began in late February 2022. This conflict disrupted global supply chains for key agricultural commodities and energy. Remember that Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of wheat, corn, sunflower, oil, fertilizer and petroleum. As soon as the war began, it caused international prices of these commodities to skyrocket. In fact, United Nations FAO World Food Price Index hit an all-time high of 160 points in March 2022, immediately after this war began. Remember, India is a net importer of edible oils and fertilizers, and it is integrated in world commodities market. And so India also felt the heat of something that is known as imported inflation. The inflation not domestically but imported because of inflation globally. The second shock was weather related. A prolonged and strong El Nino from 2023 to May 2024. Now we understand that El Nino refers to a warming of ocean surface temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific, which alters global weather patterns. Now, as far as the South Asia or Southeast Asia is concerned, El Nino is typically linked with weaker monsoon and drought tendencies. We know that monsoon in 2023 was extremely low as compared to normal averages, with large part of the country receiving deficient rainfall. In fact, the El Nino of 2023-24 turned out to be one of the longer and stronger ones on record. Sea surface temperature in Pacific rose over 2 degrees Celsius above normal, far exceeding 0.5 threshold for El Nino in the previous occasions. This drastically impacted monsoon rainfall across the country, which resulted in crop losses and hence supply shock inducing food inflation. Remember, it was 11.5% in July 2023 at its peak. Always remember a memorable episode where tomatoes briefly became costlier than petrol in parts of India. Thus, supply shock, war, and weather were the chief drivers of India's inflation in this period of last 2 years. But thankfully, by late 2024 and early 2025, the situation on the food supply front began to turn around dramatically. The El Nino event ended around May 2024 and was followed by signs of an opposite phase, La Nina, which traditionally have brought better rainfall into India's subcontinent. Now, as there was no major weather shock in late 2024, India saw bumper harvest in 2024 and 25. A bumper Kharif harvest was followed by a very high and good yielding Rabi crop in 2024 and 25 winter. The impact of all of these on inflation was immediate, as food inflation cooled dramatically in the first few months of 2025, dropping to 2.7% in March 2025. At the same time, the government's own supply side interventions, like import duty cuts on some pulses and release of buffer stocks of onion, helped mitigate extreme price swings. By mid-2025, with record high rice stocks and improving wheat reserves, India's food security position looked extremely comfortable. At the same time, global factors also turned favorable. International commodity prices for food had eased, and crucially, crude oil prices declined, which meant lower transport and fuel cost. In fact, the FAO Food Price Index in April 2025 was 128, far below its wartime peak of 162. Now, if anyways you are ignoring the external sector and foreign exchange, now if by any chance you are ignoring exchange rate volatility and external sector developments to take into account the overall monetary policy, then you should not commit that mistake. Remember, the period of 2023 and 2025 also saw significant swings in India's external sector indicators, particularly the exchange rate of rupee and the level of foreign exchange reserves, which had implications for inflation and policy. For instance, in 2024 and early 2025, the Indian rupee experienced sharp depreciation, driven largely by global factors. Let's not go into all those factors as of now. The rupee, for instance, which had maintained generally the level of 80 to 83 rupees per US dollar range, fell to an all-time low of 87.99 rupees per US dollars. This was accompanied by volatility in capital flows and sentiments as well. Of course, one major trigger was the outcome of US presidential elections, which had rightly predicted a kind of revival of trade wars and protectionist policies, and so the capital had to flow back to the United States of America, which was so far invested in Indian market. So as expected, a weak rupee made the imports costlier, adding to imported inflation that was discussed over here. For instance, the landed cost of crude oil, edible oil, electronics, all of that rose. Because if $1 yields 80 rupees and if same $1 yields 90 rupees, you can see whatever you import is now dearer as compared to before. At the same time, you can see that foreign exchange reserves dropped to $624 billion, which in 2023 had reached the peak of $704 billion as a result of mega capital inflow into our country. However, the condition worsened to such a level that RBI had to intervene to control the exchange rate volatility. For example, RBI uses reserves, exactly the reserves that we were banking upon, to supply dollars and buy rupees in the market whenever there is excessive volatility. This smooths any sharp fall of rupee. Now, the strategy in late 2024 was to prevent a panic slide beyond the psychologically important 90 rupees per dollar mark. Now, obviously, this approach seemed to work. It halted the rupee's decline, and later on it was to be stabilized around an average price of 85.5 rupees per dollar. At the same time, fiscal policy and tariff wars had also started. For instance, in 2025, Indian government complemented monetary efforts with fiscal and trade policy measures to address inflation and support domestic industry. So you remember that a series of anti-dumping duties and safeguard tariffs were imposed on specific imports from China and some other countries in early 2025. So you know that anti-dumping duties are duties or tariffs that are levied to protect local manufacturers from unfairly low prices or maybe dumped imports, while safeguard duties are temporary measures to protect against sudden import surges. So these two have very specific application. So for instance, India imposed anti-dumping duties on a range of Chinese goods like aluminum foil, vacuum flasks, polyvinyl chloride or what is known as PVC, solar glass, titanium dioxide. So you can see that there were a plethora of products on which India imposed anti-dumping duty, and these actions came. The report that Chinese exporters faced new set of US tariffs and were redirecting their products to Indian markets. In fact, RBI's April 2025 policy report clearly noted the prospect of cheap imports from countries like China and Vietnam was exerting disinflationary pressure on core goods prices. For example, cheaper Chinese electronics or intermediate good could reduce input costs in India's manufacturing. However, government chose to intervene with duties for certain products to prevent dumping. These duties could raise prices of those specific goods domestically, since domestic producers often have higher costs than dumped imports. For instance, 12% duty on imported steel might keep steel prices higher than they otherwise should be, potentially pushing up the cost for sectors like auto manufacturing or construction in short run. So why to impose them, especially keeping in account the high inflation? The reasoning is that extremely cheap dumped imports, while short-term deflationary, can devastate local industries, leading to job losses and future supply constraint, which could themselves be inflationary in the long term. The government likely identified products where India has domestic manufacturing potential and decided to shield them from predation or dumping. Now, over time, these measures encouraged import substitution. Domestic firms gain market share and can achieve economies of scale, hopefully bringing prices down sustainably. For example, protecting the domestic solar glass or PVC resin industry could in long term make India self-reliant and less exposed to import price volatility. In the long term, it would balance inflation and at the same time achieve the target of Make in India. Up next is an article on Iran nuclear deal. Iran says nuclear talks will fail if US pushes for zero enrichment. Now there are too many technical terms involved in this what seemingly looks like a very small article, where nuclear talks between Iran and United States will lead nowhere if Washington insists that Tehran drop its uranium enrichment activity to zero. Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran was quoted by state media on Monday as saying this thing. First, let's understand what is enrichment. When you look at the uranium, that is a naturally occurring mineral, it occurs at a very, very low concentration. And that too, when it occurs in two different kinds of isotopes. One of them is radioactive, another one is stable. The concentration of the radioactive isotope is extremely, extremely low. And that is why, as you can see, that we have to first increase the concentration of the radioactive isotope of uranium to make it either a weapon or to derive any kind of nuclear energy from it. That is a long drawn process which involves a lot of technological intervention and development. And that is why, going back to 1957, where Iran's nuclear journey began with the help of US itself under Eisenhower program, Atoms for Peace agreement with USA. What an irony. In fact, in 1968, Iran signed Non-Proliferation Treaty, where Iran became non-nuclear weapon state under NPT. But soon things were to take a drastic U-turn, where Iran underwent Islamic Revolution and declared itself as a hostile country to United States of America. And hence, all US supports towards Iran ended. Nuclear programs stalled under the new regime. In 2002, it was revealed to the world that Iran was already running a nuclear facility at a place called Natanz. and it was undeclared to the world. And that's when the global community increased its scrutiny of Iran's nuclear project. For some time, Iran did stop the nuclear enrichment, but in 2006, Iran resumes uranium enrichment, and that is when the United Nations Security Council adopts resolution and sanctions. Eventually, in 2015, a Joint Comprehension Plan of Action or JCPOA P5+1 signed an agreement with Iran where they agreed to limit nuclear activity in exchange for sanction relief. A deal was signed between US, UK, France, Russia, China and Germany along with Iran, where on one hand Iran decided to give up its nuclear enrichment program, and on the other hand Western world decided to give Iran relief in terms of financial as well as military sanctions. But the problem was that in 2018, United States of America under the leadership of President Trump decided to exit the deal and sanctions were reimposed on Iran. And that is when Iran rolls back JCPOA committee and its commitments and begins enrichment beyond agreed limit. And that's when tensions start to emerge. And because of which in 2022, in Vienna, negotiations were again brought on track. But little progress could be made because of US and Iran mistrust with each other. And recently the reports have emerged that Iran has enriched uranium up to 60% purity, which is very, very close to the 90% limit that is required for weapons grade threshold. And that is when the talks have again reinitiated to bring Iran or nudge Iran back from the path to the nuclear weapon. So you can see that even a minor news has multiple dimensions on GS paper, especially with respect to its implication on GS paper 2, effects of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interests. Now if you look at the impact of any outcome of Iran nuclear deal, is going to be multidimensional on India's interests. For instance, let's look at the energy security. Iran is a major source of crude oil for India, historically among India's top 3 oil suppliers. Now, US sanctions on Iran, especially under the maximum pressure campaign, have forced India to reduce or stop oil imports from Iran since 2019, which obviously increases India's dependence on volatile Gulf countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and so impacting India's strategic oil reserves and import bills. At the same time, there are a lot of strategic projects that are being run relying on Iran's support. For instance, Chabahar port in southeastern Iran is a critical infrastructure project jointly developed by India, giving it access to Afghanistan and Central Asia bypassing Pakistan. If the nuclear deal collapses and tensions escalate, Iran's isolation deepens, affecting project's execution. US pressure might force India to go slow or even halt investments. In such an instance, it could also hamper India's international north-south transport corridor, which could force India to lose strategic leverage against China's presence in Gwadar in Pakistan. When it comes to regional stability and security, a nuclear-capable Iran could trigger a nuclear arms race in West Asia. For instance, Saudi Arabia may also want to have a weapon. It may increase sectarian tensions between Shias in Iran versus Sunnis in rest of the states, disrupting the regional balance. Remember, India has around 8 million plus diaspora population in this area. Any conflict may lead to evacuation operation like previously done under Operation Rahat and oil prices spiking. Also, the terrorist group might want to exploit this situation in the region, increasing the overall chaos and the cost for India. Now, whenever such a confrontation happens, India will be forced to align either with US or against US. Now, you know that India is closely aligned with US and Israel. Both oppose a nuclear-powered Iran, but also value historical ties with Iran. A fully nuclear Iran will worsen US-Iran tensions, and India will be under pressure to pick sides. And it will hurt strategic autonomy of our country. Also, remember that India is an extremely responsible nuclear state and a proponent of non-proliferation despite being outside the overall framework of non-proliferation treaty. If Iran violates NPT commitment, it could weaken the global NPT regime and may complicate India's case for being included into nuclear supplier group. And towards the end, with Iran under Western sanction, Iran is likely to lean in favor of China, which will impact India's interest in Iran. Also, China is already sitting at Gwadar airport in Pakistan. Plus, if it manages to get strategic positions in Iran, that could complicate matters for India. So you can see that the best outcome is to have a negotiated settlement between Iran and the Western powers, and that is best for India's interests as well. Let's now move on to the next discussion. The next article that we have taken up has appeared on page number 1. In-house probe has no legal sanctity, says Vice President. Now, you know that there was an incident that was reported at the premises of the residence of Justice Verma, who was previously the High Court judge of Delhi High Court. What was revealed as a subsequent matter turned out to be an extremely serious problem facing India's judiciary. A huge pile of cash was revealed, which raised a lot of concerns about the integrity in judiciary, the lack of accountability within judiciary, which led to sharp criticism of the functioning of judiciary and its opaqueness, which resulted into the transfer of this High Court judge to Allahabad High Court. And in this context, the executive in our country has sharpened the attack on judiciary. The Vice President has said that the in-house probe by a panel of 3 judges into allegations of discovery of unaccounted cash at the official residence of Justice Yashwant Verma does not have any constitutional premise or legal sanctity, but most importantly, it will be inconsequential, and wondered why no FIR has been registered in the matter yet. Now, this deals with a very important matter dealing with one of the crucial constitutional provision created to protect the independence of higher judiciary, that is the process of removal of High Court as well as Supreme Court judges. It is extremely important perspective from prelims point of view, because if you look, 2 questions back to back, one in prelims 2018 and another one in 2019, both test our understanding of knowledge of constitutional provision related to higher judiciary, both of which test our understanding of the removal process of higher judiciary. Now let's go through the discussion, understand the removal process, and then see whether we are able to answer the questions or not. So when it comes to the constitutional provision with respect to the removal of judge of Supreme Court or High Court, the procedure according to the Constitution is same. The Constitution of India says that judge of High Court and Supreme Court can only be removed on the basis of proved misbehavior and incapacity, and they can only be removed on the order by the President after a resolution by each house of the Parliament has been passed by 2/3 of the members present and voting, which should be more than half of the member of the houses. So after this resolution has been passed and then the order is issued by the President, then the specific judge of High Court or Supreme Court, as the case may be, stands removed. But rest of the provisions with respect to the removal process is not dealt in the Constitution of India, because Constitution of India says Parliament may by law create further provisions or procedures for the removal of the judges of the High Court or Supreme Court, and that is why the text that you see in the red color is dealt not in the Constitution of India, but they are dealt by the Judges Inquiry Act 1968, which says that if 100 members of Lok Sabha or 50 members of Rajya Sabha, as the case may be, move the resolution, come up with a request to the presiding officer about an allegation of proven misbehavior or incapacity, then presiding officer may either admit or refuse to admit the motion, which means that presiding officer has absolute veto power over whether to go ahead with the removal process or not. If he says no, then no means no. However, if presiding officer agrees that yes, there is a ground for the removal and there are chances that there could be misbehavior or incapacity, then the presiding officer will constitute a committee consisting of a Supreme Court judge, a High Court Chief Justice, and a distinguished jurist. It will be the task of the committee to investigate the matter. Now, after the investigation, committee will submit the report to the presiding officer. Now, if committee says that no proof or evidence was found for misbehavior and incapacity, then the resolution cannot go ahead. However, if the committee believes that there are substantial grounds of proven misbehavior and incapacity, then the address will be presented to that house. And if that is passed by majority of 2/3 and half, then it will go to the second house, where again the address has to be passed by the same majority, and all of this procedure has to be completed within one session of the house. If the session is prorogued in between, then irrespective of at which stage the resolution is, it will have to be restarted. And if all of this is done in one session and it is sent to president, and if president issues an order, the judge of the higher judiciary shall stand removed. The next article for discussion: Delhi Assembly passes only one bill in 2024, appears on regional news page of Delhi. So Delhi Assembly has passed only a single bill in the entire 2024 year. The least number of bills passed by any state or union territory assembly in India. This finding from a report released on Monday by non-profit organization PRS Legislative Research on the Functioning of State Legislatures. Now, if you look at the syllabus, main syllabus of GS paper 2, you can see that Parliament and state legislatures, their structures, functioning, conduct of business, powers and privileges and issues arising out of these is a part of your syllabus. And less number of sittings every year is crucially connected to the productivity of the assemblies in our country. Now, in this regard, I have already done the discussion with respect to parliamentary productivity, the reasons for its decline, in This Week in Polity and Governance video dated 7th of June, the link to which will be provided in the description of the video. So if you want to have, and you should have, the full perspective, you should go to this video to understand all the dynamics. However, what we will do right now is to have a look at the data that clearly shows declining parliamentary productivity in India's parliament, that is the Central Assembly, both Lok Sabha as well as Rajya Sabha. So the first graph that you have shows parliament has been sitting for lesser days and passing fewer bills. As you can see that initially the first Lok Sabha, denoted by the yellow color, used to sit on an average for around 130 to 140 days every year, which means around 1/3 of the total days were allocated for discussion, debate. Now, there is a clear declining trend to the extent that between 2018 and 19, the parliament sat only around 70 days. Now, barring the exception of COVID, you can see that the trend is still declining. When it comes to the discussion on budget, which is another marker for the productivity, you can see how after the peak that was achieved in 1962, it has become dismally low. As far as number of adjournment motions, the motions which disrupt and force the government to consider the matter raised by the parliamentarians, or no confidence motions, you can see there is a declining trend as well. The adjournment motions are indicated here with the green buildings, and you can see on an average there is a stark decline at the same time. When it comes to no confidence motion, look at more than 5, on an average 5-3, to in last 3 sessions, in last 3-4 parliament, down to 1 per 5 years. Similarly, you can see that there continues to be the absence or vacancy at the level of deputy speaker, which by convention has to belong to the opposition parties. So this particular graph is very innovative graph, which shows that number of days taken by the Lok Sabha to elect deputy speaker, and you can see the longest is 1816, which means the entire 5-year term there was no deputy speaker. When it comes to the participation of non-government members in lawmaking, denoted by private member bill and private member resolution, the ability of non-government functionaries to participate in lawmaking, you can see that out of 47 private member bills, 0 were passed and 0 were discussed, and that is for Lok Sabha. In case of Rajya Sabha, around 68 bills were introduced, around 68 bills were listed for introduction, 0 were introduced and 0 were discussed. Similar is the case with private member resolution, whereas only 1 private member resolution was eventually discussed. Now again, coming back to the same point, if you have to understand what are the reason behind the decline of parliamentary productivity, I would highly recommend you to go and watch this lecture that is available on Rouse IAS YouTube channel. The last news for today deals with criminal matters. Union Home Minister Amit Shah on Monday said they have introduced the new Zero FIR that automatically converts cyber financial crime complaints with a cheating value of above 10 lakh rupees registered either on 1930 helpline or National Cybercrime Reporting Portal into proper FIRs. Now, in this particular keyword, E0 FIR, you can see there are three keywords, E0 and then FIR. And all of them are proper criminal law term. If you're wondering if it is relevant for UPSC examination or not, let me just throw at you a prelims question of 2021, which expected us the distinction between judicial custody and police custody. As you can see, judicial custody means an accused is in custody of the concerned magistrate, and such accused is locked up in police station, not in jail. During the judicial custody, the police officer in charge of the case is not allowed to interrogate the suspect without the approval of the court. So you can see that UPSC has tested the basic knowledge, and there is an increasing tendency for the prelims examination to test the criminal matters. Now in this regard, let us understand first what an FIR is. Whenever an event happens, that event, if it is a cognizable offense, the notice has to be taken by the police or the law enforcement agencies. Now, what is a cognizable offense and what is not a cognizable offense is defined in Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. For example, murder is a cognizable offense if there is any reporting with respect to a dead body that is being found. The police has to take notice of that. Rape is a cognizable offense. Abduction or kidnapping is a cognizable offense where the police has to take cognizance or notice, and how the police will take the notice is through officially writing down first information report or an FIR. However, if the incident that is being reported is non-cognizable, then a non-cognizable report or NCR has to be filed rather than FIR. After the filing of FIR begins the phase of investigation. The question is, what is Zero FIR? Now you can see that generally Indian laws expect people to report the crime in the local area of jurisdiction of the respective station, police station. Which means that if a crime has happened at this particular place X, then first the idea is to find out which police station has jurisdiction over this area X. If that happens to be a police station A, then the FIR has to be generally registered at a place A. But in certain cases, A might not be willing to register an FIR, or maybe the victim of the crime has fled the jurisdiction at another place B and does not want to return, and in that case, can they file an FIR at a jurisdiction where incident did not take place? If the answer is yes, that is known as Zero FIR. So FIR is a written document prepared by the police upon receiving information about a cognizable offense. First step towards the investigation process. It sets in motion the probe and further action by the police. Now, failure to register an FIR is a punishable offense for public servants. If they fail to record information relating to a cognizable offense, then they will be punished for it. Punishment includes imprisonment for up to 2 years and a fine. Now, Zero FIR is an FIR that can be registered by any police station irrespective of its jurisdiction when a police station receives a complaint regarding a cognizable offense. No regular FIR number is assigned at this stage. After receiving the Zero FIR, the relevant police station registers a fresh FIR and starts the investigation. It is meant to help victims of serious crimes, especially women and children, to lodge a complaint quickly and conveniently without having to go from one police station to another. It is also meant to ensure that the evidence and witnesses are not lost or tampered with due to delays in filing the complaint. It is transferred to the relevant police station where the offense has taken place or where the investigation has to be conducted. So I hope FIR and Zero FIR is clear. Let's now move on to E0 FIR. So the initiative that the Ministry of Home Affairs has taken or launched yesterday allows you to file Zero FIR in an online fashion if it deals with a financial fraud which has a value of more than 10 lakh rupees. So as soon as you dial up this number 1930 and complain that my bank account was defrauded of 15 lakh rupees, the system will automatically register an FIR on your behalf. That is what is e-governance or E0 FIR. The last article for today deals with Jal Jeevan Scheme. After cost overrun, government to send 100 teams to inspect the JJ scheme. Now, it is extremely important both from the perspective of prelims examination as well as from the point of view of mains examination, especially in GS paper 2, where schemes and policies are important to be scrutinized. And today we are going to look at the basic features of this scheme. We will cover as and when these teams report back the issues being faced by on the ground. So initially, National Rural Drinking Water Program existed as a part of flagship scheme of the central government. Later on, it was rebranded as Jal Jeevan Mission under the Ministry of Jal Shakti. It is a centrally sponsored scheme because it deals with the tap water, which is ideally the matter to be administered by the state governments. It was launched in 2019 to provide functional household tap connections, which are just not about tap, just not about connection. The water should flow from those connections, ensuring a service level of 55 liters per capita per day. So key achievement is that it has increased the tap water coverage from 3.23 crore to around 15 crore rural households. Around 8 states and 3 union territories have achieved 100% tap water connection. And as far as institutional changes are concerned, 88.91% of schools and 85% of Anganwadi centers now receive tap water. Har Ghar Jal status, 2.28 lakh villages and 190 districts have achieved Har Ghar Jal status. So there are multiple sub-components to this particular scheme. There is a component about water quality to ensure safe drinking water to reduce waterborne ailments. Tap water supply we have already seen. It involves bottoms-up planning where community engagement in planning and implementation and operation and maintenance is required. It also deals with women empowerment, involvement of women in planning, decision making, implementation and monitoring. But apart from that, women are the first people who are sent to fetch the water if it is not locally available. It promotes groundwater recharge and water conservation. Grey water management, which means reuse and recycle of the water for source sustenance. It involves skill development and focus on future generations as well. That's it for today. Download the notes from our Telegram channel. Stay tuned for more such updates.